The world's biggest economies, the United States and China, have had a complicated economic and geopolitical relationship that relies on competition and cooperation at the same time.
I'm in favor of maintaining a working relationship with China. It is too important a country. It had made good progress in economic reform, and I think we should not lightly sacrifice a relationship with the country with the longest continuing history in Asia, with the cultural influence that it has.
China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, setting the stage for a tumultuous relationship between the United States and China that continues today.
With China, we have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China, and unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal. Now, I'm willing to deal with China, but they have to solve their surplus.
With the tariff program, we had a plan, we have a process, and now we have a mechanism with our Chinese counterparts to prevent an escalation again. We're going to go into a series of negotiations. They're going to be fulsome, and we have a lot to talk about, but I think over the next 90 days we can accomplish a lot.
President Trump has continued the efforts of his first administration to make the economic relationship between the two countries fair, initially imposing tariffs as high as 145% before suspending them pending negotiations. Niall Ferguson has called it a second Cold War.
It's 18 years since I used the term chimerica for the first time, and the argument back then was China and the United States are in a symbiotic relationship, but it's not symmetrical. The US does the importing, China does the exporting, the US does the consuming, and China does the saving. And the argument that I made back in 2007 was that this was not really sustainable, and that at some point chimerica would turn out to be a chimera. It actually took longer than I expected to turn sour, but certainly by 2017-18 we had the beginnings of Cold War II, when the rise of China finally elicited a response from the United States. The interesting thing, David, is that somehow chimerica and Cold War II seem capable of coexisting, because despite a trade war and a tech war, both continued by the Biden administration and ramped up by Donald Trump in his second term, the United States still imports an enormous amount from China. The relationship has been extraordinarily persistent despite the growing conflict and the escalation of Cold War II.
I'd call it hostile codependence. We're codependent with them. We depend on them. They depend on us. But our interests in the way the world is shaped going forward are very different. There can only be one leader in technology. So there are also important zero-sum competitive aspects in the relationship, and the challenge is going to be to manage it.
As much as Larry Summers agrees that the U.S. and China need each other, he does think we may be wrong about the extent of Chinese economic power.
I think the big change that, to my mind, people are underestimating is that China has immense challenges ahead of it. Yes, they have done very well in a number of key technologies, but their population is going to shrink, their debts are immense, their economic adjustment towards a more consumption-oriented economy would force the Communist Party to give up a lot of power, which I don't think they're going to do. You know, David, here's a rule. When the American elite tell their children to learn a language, it's time to bet against the country in question. That was right about Russia in 1959. That was right about Japan in 1989. And I think it's been right about China in recent years. And so I think the key priority for the United States is to maintain our strength, but also not to put so much pressure on China that we elicit a spasmodic response. Niall's the historian and he's the great expert, but many people see this through the prism of Germany and Britain before the First World War, I think it's also helpful to think about Japan and the United States before the Second World War, where a very successful set of American economic policies in holding back the Japanese economy pushed the Japanese into nationalist desperation, and that was behind Pearl Harbor. So I think in the United States we need to be very careful and not see this in terms of trying to win some great victory against China, and not forgetting that codependence is probably an inevitability.
After growing over 14% a year as recently as 2017, China's growth has slumped to an estimated 4% in 2025, according to the IMF. But the U.S. may not have the economic upper hand.
China is a much larger economy relative to the United States than any previous challenger. On a current dollar basis, it's got to within around 70% of US GDP. More strikingly, China's manufacturing value added is now twice that of the United States. And if you just go back 20 years, the roles were reversed. US manufacturing value added around at the time that China joined the World Trade Organization was roughly twice that of China's. Let's view this from China's vantage point. How do the Chinese see the American response to their rise? They see it as a rather brutal trade war that began with Donald Trump's first term and has escalated dramatically at the beginning of his second term. But that escalation turned into a game of chicken, and in that game of chicken, it was Donald Trump who swerved. It was Trump who had to step down, who had to pull back from the incredibly high tariffs that he imposed in a series of steps on China after being sworn in for a second term. So the Chinese look at the United States, and I think they often say to themselves, these guys have really passed their peak and they don't have a coherent strategy to deal with us.
I'm a bit more optimistic than Niall about the relative strength of the two economies. I think a large GDP achieved simply by having a large number of people doesn't always make you stronger. Ask yourself, if Mexico was part of the United States, we would have a higher GDP as a country, but I think we'd actually, in toto, in aggregate, probably have a weaker economy in terms of our ability to project power. So I am a bit more optimistic about the hand the United States has to play than Niall, but a bit more disappointed by the skill with which we are playing it. I share his concern about a potentially very dangerous situation in Taiwan, though I would caution that probably to maintain deterrence, it's not that we need a capacity to win. We need a capacity to inflict enormous and problematic and risky damage while maintaining credibility to deter imprudence. And I think that's a bit more achievable than Niall suggests.
Well, there's certainly a risk. I've argued for some time that a Taiwan semiconductor crisis would be the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis in Cold War II. But let's remember that there's something very distinctive about the US-China relationship that makes it quite different from the 20th century conflicts and challenges that Larry talked about. China really had caught up or was very close to catching up in key domains, including artificial intelligence and quantum computing. China has shown that technological containment of the sort that Jake Sullivan recommended when he was National Security Advisor hasn't really worked.
I am far more worried about dependence on China for debt than I am dependence on China for rare earths or any other specific product.
Whether it's competition in technology or dependence on foreign investment in U.S. debt, both Larry and Niall agree that the tax and spending bill currently working its way through Congress will do little to improve the United States' position when it comes to China.
It's not a big, beautiful bill. It's a prescription for deadly, dangerous decline. It's ill-advised, it's imprudent, it fails to recognize at all a basic truth that the world's greatest debtor is unlikely to stay the world's greatest power. We are making a very serious mistake by continuing on the fiscal path that we are on. And it's not even clear that if we're given more rope, if the debts are allowed to grow, that may just be ultimately increasing our vulnerability. Niall and I are in complete agreement on that.
Well, these relationships are complex, but you could simplify the story a bit by just saying as long as the United States consistently runs a large budget deficit, it's probably going to run a rather large current account deficit, and attacking bilateral trade imbalances is unlikely to overcome that fundamental problem. There's nothing in President Trump's big, beautiful bill that's currently going through Congress that seems likely to reduce the US federal deficit from around 6 or thereabouts % of GDP. And so the debt continues to accumulate. Ferguson's law, which I introduced back in January to try to focus the administration's mind, states that when a great power is spending more on interest payments than on defense, it probably won't be great for that much longer. And that is a law that has applied to every empire since Spain's in the 17th century. And so I think if you look at the fiscal position of the United States, that's the fundamental structural problem. And as long as presidents, including President Trump, won't touch the underlying problems of Social Security and Medicare, an aging population with a welfare system designed for a previous demographic structure, the imbalance is bound to persist. It's worth adding, though, that China also has its fiscal problem.
Niall and I are also in agreement that what's called the taco trade in markets, Trump always chickens out, which is why people see market declines because of one of these tariff announcements as a buying moment. That taco trade in markets is a geopolitical disaster because it tempts adventurism, just as John Kennedy's ignominious retreat at the Bay of Pigs contributed to the problems that the United States faced later, very dangerous moments at Berlin, at the Cuban Missile Crisis, show these blustering threats followed by retreat on tariffs make us not credible and with big ambition. Speaking loudly and carrying a small stick is a prescription for compromising your national security.